Sec. Military historians will tell you something most moviegoers never consider. Only a handful of WWII films actually got it right. Studios spent billions recreating the war, yet most got the uniforms wrong, the tactics wrong, even the weather wrong. So which films survived the scrutiny of veterans, archivists, and battlefield scholars? These 10 are free on YouTube right now, and they will wreck you. Number 10. The Battle of Britain, 1969. Here is a film that assembled more airworthy Spitfires and Hurricanes in one production than the Royal Air Force currently has in its entire active fleet. That alone should tell you everything about the scale of what director Guy Hamilton attempted in 1969 and why military aviation historians still treat this film like a primary source document rather than entertainment. The Battle of Britain covers the summer of 1940 when Nazi Germany attempted to destroy the RAF as a prelude to a full-scale invasion of England. Operation Sea Lion, Hitler's planned amphibious assault, hinged entirely on Luftwaffe supremacy. The film captures this with a level of tactical authenticity that stunned veterans who had actually flown those missions. RAF pilots who served in the real battle were brought on as consultants, and their fingerprints are visible in every engagement sequence. The radio communication protocols, the scramble procedures, the way exhausted pilots slept beside their aircraft in full gear, all of it was reconstructed from official RAF logs and personal testimonies. What makes this entry genuinely remarkable is the German side of the story. The Luftwaffe commanders, particularly the portrayal of Hermann Göring's frustrating strategic miscalculations, are presented without cartoonish villainy. The decision to shift bombing targets from RAF airfields to London, widely considered one of the greatest tactical blunders of the war, is dramatized with chilling clarity. Historians point to this scene as the moment the film transcends entertainment and becomes genuine military education. The production used over 100 vintage aircraft, making it the largest aerial armada assembled for a film in cinema history at that point. The logistics were so complex that the production effectively operated its own private air force for nearly a year. The film underperformed at the American box office because United Artists felt audiences in the U.S. had little emotional connection to a purely British campaign. British audiences, however, made it one of the highest-grossing films of 1960. Number 9. Cross of Iron, 1977. Sam Peckinpah made exactly one WWII film, and he chose to make it from the perspective of a Wehrmacht sergeant on the Eastern Front, which in 1977 was considered either a stroke of genius or an act of cinematic madness. Studios in Hollywood had spent 30 years portraying German soldiers exclusively as monsters or cowards. Peckinpah decided to do something different, and the result is one of the most psychologically complex war films ever committed to celluloid. Cross of Iron is set during the Soviet counteroffensive at the Taman Peninsula in 1943, a period of catastrophic German retreat that is almost entirely absent from Western World War II cinema. The film follows Sergeant Rolf Steiner, played by James Coburn in arguably the finest performance of his career. A career soldier who has lost all ideological allegiance to the Nazi regime, but continues fighting out of loyalty to his men and sheer survival instinct. This distinction between fighting for a cause versus fighting for the man next to you is something military psychologists have identified as the dominant motivator for soldiers across all modern conflicts. Peckinpah understood this on a visceral level. The historical accuracy here operates on two levels. First, the tactical authenticity is extraordinary. The film's depiction of German defensive positions, fallback strategies, and the psychological deterioration of troops in prolonged retreat was verified by several Wehrmacht veterans who served as consultants. The equipment, the uniforms with the correct insignia for the period and theater, even the specific field rations shown, were all sourced through meticulous research. Second, and more importantly, the film accurately captures the moral chaos of the Eastern Front. a theater of war defined by atrocity on both sides, where the boundaries between soldier and criminal had long since dissolved. Peckinpah himself called it his anti-war statement disguised as a war film. Roger Ebert praised it as one of the most honest portrayals of combat psychology ever made. Number 8. They Were Expendable, 1945. This film was released before the war officially ended, making it perhaps the only major WWII film made while the events it depicts were still technically ongoing. John Ford directed it, which is reason enough to pay attention, but the historical weight behind it comes from a source most people overlook. The story is true, and the man it is based on was still alive and actively opposed to the film being made about him. They Were Expendable tells the story of Motor Torpedo Boat Squadron 3 and their role in the defense and fall of the Philippines following Pearl Harbor. The film is based on the real experiences of Lieutenant Commander John Bulkley, whose PT boats harassed Japanese naval forces during the chaotic American retreat from Bataan and Corregidor. General Douglas MacArthur was evacuated from Corregidor aboard one of Bulkley's PT boats in March 1942. A moment the film recreates with remarkable fidelity to the documented record. What historians find particularly valuable about this film is its unflinching portrayal of American defeat. Hollywood in 1945 was under enormous pressure to produce triumphalist content, stories of American invincibility and certain victory. Ford instead delivered a film about retreat, loss, exhaustion, and the grinding indignity of watching the Philippines fall despite genuine heroism. The Navy was so concerned about the film's emotional honesty that they reviewed the script multiple times before granting cooperation. Robert Montgomery, who played Lieutenant Rusty Ryan, had actually served in PT boats during the war and brought authentic muscle memory to the role. John Wayne, cast as Brickley, later said that working on this film with Ford reshaped his understanding of what genuine military service required of a person. Ford himself had served in a Naval Reserve unit during the war and filmed actual combat footage in the Pacific, giving him a first-hand understanding of the material he was translating to screen. The film's production designer worked from original Navy blueprints of PT boats to ensure the vessels were replicated with precision. Naval historians have cited specific sequences, particularly the nighttime torpedo runs, as technically accurate enough to be used in training contexts decades after the film's release. That is the gold standard for historical authenticity in war filmmaking. Number 7. Dunkirk, 1958. Before Christopher Nolan's immersive 2017 version rewired how audiences experienced the Dunkirk evacuation, there was this British production from 1958 that many military historians argue is actually more accurate in its ground-level portrayal of the event's chaos and human cost. It is quieter, grittier, and far less interested in spectacle, which is precisely why it gets so many details correct. The 1958 Dunkirk, directed by Leslie Norman, covers Operation Dynamo from 3 perspectives: the soldiers stranded on the beach, the civilian boat owners pressed into emergency service, and the journalists and ordinary citizens back in England trying to understand what was happening across the channel. This triangulation of viewpoints mirrors exactly how historians have come to document the event through military records, civilian testimonies, and contemporary press accounts. What makes this film historically extraordinary is the beach sequences. Norman and his team worked directly from survivor testimonies collected by the Imperial War Museum, and the resulting scenes capture something that more polished productions often miss: the sheer organizational collapse that preceded the miracle. Soldiers waiting in lines that stretched for miles, officers losing command authority, men from different units with no coordination, and often no officers at all, making individual decisions about survival. This is not the heroic orderly retreat of popular mythology. This is the documented historical reality. The film also handles the French element of Dunkirk with considerably more honesty than most British productions of its era. Approximately 100,000 French soldiers were evacuated alongside British troops, but many more were left behind to cover the retreat and were subsequently captured. The film does not shy away from this moral complexity, showing British military decisions that prioritized British troops in ways that created lasting bitterness in Franco-British relations. John Mills, who plays the central soldier character, researched the role by meeting with Dunkirk veterans in the years immediately following the war. Their accounts informed his physical performance in ways that are visible throughout: the hollow eyes, the mechanical movement of men who have been awake and under artillery fire for days. This film is free on YouTube and deserves to be seen alongside, not instead of Nolan's version. They tell the same story in fundamentally different registers, and both are essential. Number 6. The Longest Day, 1962. No other WWII film has ever been made with this level of institutional cooperation from the actual governments and military establishments that participated in the real events. The Longest Day, produced by Darryl F. Zanuck at a cost that would exceed $130 million in today's money, brought together American, British, French, and German military advisors, veterans, and official historians in a production collaboration that has never been replicated before or since. The film covers June 6, 1944, the D-Day landings at Normandy across all 5 beaches and multiple airborne operations simultaneously. It is told from American, British, French resistance, and German perspectives, with each nationality's scenes filmed in their own language by directors from those respective countries. Andrew Martin handled the American segments, Ken Anakin directed the British and French sequences, and Bernhard Wicki filmed the German portions. The result is the closest thing to a comprehensive operational overview of D-Day that cinema has ever produced. The German perspective sequences deserve particular attention from a historical accuracy standpoint. The film accurately depicts the catastrophic confusion within the German High Command on the morning of June 6th, including the decision not to wake Hitler to authorize the release of the Panzer Reserves, a decision that military historians have argued may have been the single most consequential tactical error of the entire Western campaign. Werner Hinz's portrayal of Hitler's delayed response to the landings is chillingly accurate to the documented timeline. Veterans who participated in the D-Day landings were consulted extensively throughout production, and several served as technical advisors on specific sequences. The Omaha Beach assault, filmed partly on location at the actual site with French military cooperation, reproduces the tidal conditions, the specific geography of the bluffs, and the positioning of German defensive emplacements with a fidelity that military historians have called exceptional. John Wayne reportedly wept watching the rushes of the Omaha sequences, saying they were the closest thing he had seen to the accounts veterans had shared with him privately. The film won 2 Academy Awards and remains the definitive multi-perspective cinematic account of the most consequential single day in 20th century military history. Number 5. Das Boot, 1981. There is a version of this film that runs for over 5 hours. The theatrical cut, released internationally, is already one of the most claustrophobic and psychologically devastating war films ever made. The full director's cut, which German television broadcast as a mini-series, is considered by naval historians to be the single most accurate depiction of submarine warfare in cinema history. Full stop. No qualification required. Das Boot, directed by Wolfgang Petersen, follows the crew of U-96 on a combat patrol in the North Atlantic during the autumn of 1941, a period when the Battle of the Atlantic was at its most brutal, and when German U-boat losses were beginning to escalate sharply. The film was based on the autobiographical novel by war correspondent Lothar Günther Buchheim, who actually sailed aboard U-96 during the war and documented everything he witnessed with a journalist's precision. Petersen spent 2 years in pre-production working with actual U-boat veterans and naval engineers to reconstruct a submarine interior of exact historical specification. The Type 7C U-boat set built for the film was so accurate that German naval veterans who visited the set reportedly had visceral stress responses, recognizing specific valve configurations, equipment placements, and spatial dimensions that matched their wartime memories precisely. One veteran was reported to have left the set and needed time outside before he could continue the visit. The film's production involved mounting cameras on gyroscopically stabilized rigs inside the set to replicate the actual motion of a submerged submarine under depth charge attack. The cast spent weeks in the confined set before filming began, allowing physical and psychological adaptation to the cramped environment that registers genuinely on screen. The actors lost weight during production, and the pallor and exhaustion visible in their faces. Number 4. Patton, 1970. Franklin Schaffner's biographical epic won 7 Academy Awards, including Best Picture. But the accolade that matters most to historians is something that cannot be awarded. The fact that surviving members of Patton's actual staff, men who served directly under General George S. Patton during the European campaign, said that George C. Scott's performance was eerily accurate. Not just accurate to the historical record, accurate to the man himself. The film covers Patton's command from North Africa through the German surrender, focusing particularly on the Sicily campaign, the infamous slapping incidents that nearly ended his career, his role as a decoy in Operation Fortitude during the lead-up to D-Day, and the breakneck armored advance across France in 1944. Each of these episodes is documented in extraordinary historical detail, with the screenplay written by Francis Ford Coppola and Edmund H. North, drawing extensively from Patton's actual diaries, letters, and the official military histories of the campaigns. The opening monologue, delivered by Scott in front of an enormous American flag, is drawn almost verbatim from actual speeches Patton delivered to his troops, compiled and condensed from multiple documented addresses. Military historians have noted that the language, the cadences, and even the specific metaphors used were characteristic of Patton's documented oratorical style. It is not invention, it is curation. The film's depiction of the rivalry between Patton and British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery is grounded in documented historical tension that shaped Allied strategy in ways that arguably extended the war in Northwest Europe. Patton's argument that a single concentrated thrust rather than a broad front advance would have ended the war months earlier is presented as strategically credible rather than egotistical bluster, which aligns with serious revisionist military scholarship from the 1980s onward. General Omar Bradley, played by Carl Malden, served as a technical advisor and reportedly told the production team that specific scenes depicting command decisions he had personally witnessed were reproduced with uncomfortable accuracy. When a real participant in history describes a dramatization as uncomfortable in its precision, that is not a criticism. That is the highest possible endorsement. Number 3. The Great Escape, 1963. The truth behind this film is simultaneously more mundane and more extraordinary than the movie suggests, which is a remarkable thing to say about a production that already contains a legendary motorcycle chase, a mass tunnel operation, and a story of institutional human defiance so audacious that it reads like fiction. The actual historical event it depicts is one of the most documented episodes of prisoner resistance in the entire war, and the film's relationship to that documented record is more faithful than most audiences realize. John Sturges directed The Great Escape based on Paul Brickhill's 1950 book, which Brickhill wrote as a first-hand account. Brickhill was actually a prisoner at Stalag Luft III and participated in the tunnel project, though a medical condition prevented him from being one of the escapees. The film compresses and combines several real individuals into composite characters, which is the primary departure from strict historical record, but the operational details of the escape, the 3 tunnels codenamed Tom, Dick, and Harry, the dispersal of sand, the forged documents, the stolen German uniforms, are all accurately reconstructed from prisoner testimonies and post-war British military investigations. The film's most powerful historically resonant element is what it does not sensationalize: the fate of the recaptured prisoners. Of the 76 men who escaped through Harry on the night of March 24th to 25th, 1944, only 3 reached safety. 50 were executed on Hitler's direct orders, a war crime that was later prosecuted at Nuremberg. The film handles this with restraint that makes it more devastating than graphic depiction would. The simple statement of deaths at the film's conclusion, delivered without music or dramatic framing, is one of the most effective pieces of historical documentation in cinema. Steve McQueen's motorcycle sequence is almost entirely fictional, constructed specifically to give his character, a composite of several real individuals, sufficient screen time. McQueen reportedly insisted on this, and he did much of the motorcycle riding himself. It is the film's most famous sequence, and its least historically accurate. Everything else, however, is grounded in meticulous research, survivor consultation, and documentary evidence that gives the film a moral and historical weight that entertainment alone could never manufacture. Number 2. Come and See, 1985. There is no comfortable way to describe what Elem Klimov accomplished with this Soviet production, and there is no war film in any language that has ever generated the same documented psychological response in audiences. Come and See is not a film about World War II. It is a film about what the Nazi occupation of Byelorussia transformed ordinary human beings into, both the perpetrators and the survivors. And it is so historically precise in its depiction of documented atrocities that it functions as a direct cinematic equivalent of a Nuremberg trial exhibit. The film follows a teenage boy named Flyora who joins the Soviet partisans in Byelorussia in 1943, and over the course of approximately 36 hours of story time, witnesses and survives events that age him decades before the viewer's eyes. Director Klimov and co-writer Ales Adamovich, himself a Byelorussian partisan, built the screenplay from hundreds of survivor testimonies collected through a massive oral history project. The specific atrocities depicted, the burning of villages with civilians locked inside, the structure of SS operations against partisan-supporting populations, the psychological methods used to terrorize communities into compliance, are all drawn from documented historical record with a fidelity that several historians have described as legally admissible as evidence. The actor playing Flyora, Alexei Kravchenko, was 14 years old when filming began. Klimov used actual hypnosis during certain sequences to produce the dissociative psychological states visible on the boy's face during the film's most harrowing sequences. The physical transformation visible across the film, Flyora ages visibly from scene to scene, is not prosthetics. Klimov documented that the production's duration and conditions produced genuine psychological stress that registered physically in the young actor. The film was suppressed during production by Soviet authorities concerned about its intensity, and was only permitted after significant intervention from senior cultural officials who argued that its historical documentation value outweighed the discomfort it generated. It was released in 1985. Number 1. Fires on the Plain, 1959. The film that sits at the top of this list is not the most famous WWII film on YouTube, and for audiences outside Japan, it may be entirely unfamiliar. That obscurity is its own form of historical injustice. Fires on the Plain, directed by Kon Ichikawa and based on Shohei Uka's 1951 novel drawn from his own experiences as a prisoner of war in the Philippines, depicts something that virtually no other major World War II film has ever addressed directly: the complete disintegration of military organization, the collapse of the social contract within a defeated army, and the desperate measures soldiers take when supply lines fail and institutional authority evaporates entirely. The film is set in the Philippines during the final months of the war, following a Japanese private named Tamura, who is discharged from his army unit because he has tuberculosis and sent to a field hospital that has no capacity to treat him. What follows is a journey through the landscape of a military collapse so total that it stripped away everything that distinguishes organized society from pure survival biology. Ichikawa and Uka did not flinch from depicting what actually happened among isolated Japanese units in the Philippine jungle. Which of these did you not know existed before today? Drop it in the comments, because the real question this list is forcing is this: we celebrate the films that show us the winners, the liberators, the heroic retreats. But the films that show us collapse, defeat, And what war does to the losing side are somehow always the ones nobody watches. Does that tell us something uncomfortable about why we watch war films in the first place? Are we watching history, or are we watching something else entirely?